250 years of brutal slavery, decades of black codes and Jim Crow laws, housing discrimination, and other forms of systemic racism. All of that has led to a shocking wealth gap between black and white households in the United States. The median black household in America has around $24,000 in savings, investments, home equity, and other elements of wealth. However, the median white household is around $189,000, a disparity that has worsened in recent decades. This racial wealth gap is even greater among older adults. The median white American in their late 50s had 250 more wealth than the median black American. In the last decade of the 19th century, the rate of decline in the white-to-black wealth ratio slowed, but it would take another 50 years for the gap to fall by half again, as the emergence of discriminatory laws and policies curtailed black social, political, and economic advancement. With unequal pay and limited access to capital, blacks faced challenges that made it difficult to save, invest, and accumulate wealth. To understand the need for reparations, we must first understand how the white-to-black wealth gap came to be, how blacks were kicked off their land, and every form of black wealth was destroyed in the 19th and 20th centuries, and how racism and discrimination ensured blacks would not get the same quality education, healthcare, and housing as white folks. Before we get right into the video, please smash the like button and subscribe to the channel to keep informed of our eye-opening black narrative. The brutal slave trade slavery in the United States was an institution that treated African and African Americans as property that could be bought, sold, or given away. About 600,000 slaves were transported to the United States, or 5% of the 12 million slaves taken from Africa. From 1526, during early colonial days, it was practiced in what became Britain's colonies, including the 13 colonies that formed the United States. Throughout the 17th and 18th centuries, people were kidnapped from the continent of Africa, forced into slavery in the American colonies, and exploited to work in the production of crops such as tobacco and cotton. Over the centuries, millions of enslaved people were legally treated as property in the United States, brutalized and ruthlessly exploited for free labor, which was used to establish the country as a leading global economy. In fact, one historian estimated that by 1860, enslaved people were, quote, worth some $3.5 billion, making them the largest single financial asset in the entire U.S. economy. That's around $115 billion today. Enslaved people in the antebellum South constituted about 1/3 of the Southern population. Most lived on large plantations or small farms. Many masters owned fewer than 50 enslaved people. In the late 18th century, with the land used to grow tobacco nearly exhausted, the South faced an economic crisis, and the continued growth of slavery in America seemed in doubt. By the mid-19th century, America's westward expansion and the abolition movement provoked a great debate over slavery that would tear the nation apart in the bloody Civil War. Through enslaved forced labor, black Americans created billions of dollars in generational wealth for their captors and none for themselves. Back then, the U.S. government understood the need for reparations and passed an order to distribute 40 acres and a mule to all formerly enslaved families so they could build wealth and financial security. However, after President Abraham Lincoln's assassination, President Andrew Johnson reversed Field Order 15 and returned land back to former slave owners. Instead of giving blacks the means to support themselves, the federal government empowered former enslavers. For example, in Washington, D.C., slave owners were actually paid reparations for lost property, the formerly enslaved. This practice was also common in nearby states. Many black Americans with limited work options returned as sharecroppers to till the same land for the very slave owners to whom they were once enslaved. Slave owners not only made money off the chattel enslavement of black Americans, but they then made money multiple times over off the land that the formerly enslaved had no choice but to work. Though freed, black Americans were left without any form of wealth or sustenance. This would mark the beginning of the wealth gap that we see today: Jim Crow laws and black codes. After the United States Civil War, state governments that had been part of the Confederacy tried to limit the voting rights of black citizens and prevent contact between black and white citizens in public places. Black codes and Jim Crow laws were laws passed at different periods in the southern United States to enforce racial segregation and curtail the power of black voters. After the Civil War ended in 1855, Some states passed black codes that severely limited the rights of black people, many of whom had been enslaved. These codes limited what jobs African Americans could hold and their ability to leave a job once hired. Some states also restricted the kind of property black people could own. Under black codes, many states required black people to sign yearly labor contracts. If they refused, they risked being arrested, fined, and forced into unpaid labor. During Reconstruction, many black men participated in politics by voting and by holding office. Reconstruction officially ended in 1877, and Southern states then enacted more discriminatory laws. Efforts to enforce white supremacy by legislation increased, and African Americans tried to assert their rights through legal challenges. However, this effort led to a disappointing result in 1896, when the Supreme Court ruled in Plessy versus Ferguson that so-called separate but equal facilities, including public transport and schools, were constitutional. From this time until the Civil Rights Act of 1964, discrimination and segregation were legal and enforceable. African Americans faced social, commercial, and legal discrimination. Theaters, hotels, and restaurants segregated them in inferior accommodations or refused to admit them at all. Shops served them last. In 1937, the Negro Motorist Green Book, a travel guide, was first published. It listed establishments where African American travelers could expect to receive unprejudiced service. Segregated public schools meant generations of African American children often received an education designed to be inferior to that of whites, with worn-out or outdated books, underpaid teachers, and lesser facilities and materials. However, none of these could stop the growth of black Americans ready to give all it takes to achieve financial freedom. Before the 20th century, many African Americans owned houses, farmlands, and city lots, and there was the presence of a Black Wall Street in Tulsa, with a predominantly rich black population. However, the presence of growing black wealth meant more prejudice, hatred, and jealousy from white individuals. To ensure that black wealth never becomes a thing, white Americans and the government would go to great lengths to cripple black wealth. With black people getting richer and owning more property than ever before, jealous white folks sought to using violence and deadly force to enforce the idea of white supremacy. The Tuskegee Institute and the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People have documented more than 3,000 lynchings between 1865 and 1965. Many of those lynched were landowners, and the goal behind them was to bring an end to black wealth, take black land, and uphold white supremacy. These lynchings were not only done by ordinary white people, but some white officials condoned the violence. Several of them added threats of their own. James K. Vardaman, who was governor of Mississippi from 1904 to 1908, was quoted saying, "If it is necessary, every Negro in the state will be lynched." With the start of these lynchings, mostly single families were targeted. However, in some cases, entire black communities were destroyed. The racial cleansing of Forsyth County, Georgia in 1912 and the destruction of Black Wall Street in Tulsa, Oklahoma in 1921 are some of the most significant examples. Black landowners were put under a tremendous amount of pressure, from authorities and otherwise, to give up their land and leave. They became refugees in their own country. According to property records, some were able to sell their land at a fair price, but others, such as Valentine Hightower, were not. He parted with 52 acres for $10 in 1926. Sometimes individual black farmers were singled out and attacked by bands of white farmers known as the Whitecaps. Operating in several southern and border states around the turn of the 20th century, they were intent on driving blacks from their land and discouraging other blacks from acquiring it. Whitecaps often nailed notes with crudely drawn coffins to the doors of black landowners, warning them to leave or die. Another method used was the tax sales. Tax sales were a way that the land could be taken from its owners and auctioned off. In these cases, black people would want to stay on their land instead of selling it, but most of them lived on a fixed income. Consequently, many of these homeowners eventually found themselves unable to afford their annual property taxes. Once they were in default, the county would put the property up for auction. This was something that developers used as an advantage when they wanted to access land families didn't want to sell. Redlining was another practice used to hinder black wealth and stop its progress. In 1933, faced with a housing shortage, the federal government began a program explicitly designed to increase and segregate America's housing stock. The government's efforts were primarily designed to provide housing to white, middle-class, and lower middle-class families. African Americans and other people of color were left out of the new suburban communities and pushed instead into urban housing projects. The term redlining comes from the development by the New Deal, by the federal government of maps of every metropolitan area in the country. And those maps were color-coded by first the Homeowners Loan Corporation and then the Federal Housing Administration and then adopted by the Veterans Administration. And these color codes were designed to indicate where it was safe to insure mortgages. And anywhere where African Americans lived, and anywhere where African Americans lived nearby, were colored red to indicate to appraisers that these neighborhoods were too risky to insure mortgages. Redlined areas ensured that blacks would never been able to get access to the best facilities. The Federal Housing Administration's justification was that if African Americans bought homes in these suburbs, or even if they bought homes near these suburbs, the property values of the homes they were insuring, the white homes they were insuring, would decline, and therefore their loans would be at risk. There was no basis for this claim on the part of the Federal Housing Administration. In fact, when African Americans tried to buy homes in all-white neighborhoods or in mostly white neighborhoods, property values rose because African Americans were more willing to pay more for properties than whites were, simply because their housing supply was so restricted and they had so many fewer choices. So the rationale that the Federal Housing Administration used was never based on any kind of study. It was never based on any reality. Today, African American incomes on average are about 60% of average white incomes, but African American wealth is about 5% of white wealth. Most middle-class families in this country gain their wealth from the equity they have in their homes. So this enormous difference between a 60% income ratio and a 5% wealth ratio is almost entirely attributable to federal housing policy implemented through the 20th century. African American families that were prohibited from buying homes in the suburbs in the 1940s and 50s, and even into the 60s, by the Federal Housing Administration, gained none of the equity appreciation that whites gained. So the Daly City development south of San Francisco or Levittown, or any of the others in between across the country, those homes in the late 1940s and 1950s sold for about twice national median income. They were affordable to working-class families with an FHA or VA mortgage. African Americans were equally able to afford those homes as whites, but were prohibited from buying them. Today, those homes sell for $300,000 or $400,000 at the minimum, 6-8 times national median income. When the Fair Housing Act was passed in 1986, okaying African Americans to buy homes in the suburbs, it was already impossible for the black families to afford the homes. White families continued to purchase these homes, gaining the equity and the wealth that followed from that. The white families sent their children to college with their home equities. They were able to take care of their parents in old age and not depend on their children. They're able to bequeath wealth to their children. None of those advantages accrued to African Americans, who for the most part were prohibited from buying homes in those suburbs. All these have led to the huge wealth gap between black families and white families that doesn't seem to be going anywhere soon. On top of having less wealth than white Americans to begin with, black Americans are both less likely to move up the economic ladder and more likely to slide down it. In 2019, the median wealth of black households in the United States was $24,100, compared with $108,100 for white households. Therefore, the typical black household had 12.7% of the wealth of the typical white household, and they owned $165,000 less in wealth. The average gap is somewhat smaller in relative terms, but much larger in dollar terms. The average black household had over $142,000 in 2019, compared with over $980,000 for the average white household. This means that on average, black households had 14.5% of the wealth of white households, with an absolute dollar gap of over $838,000. The persistent black-white wealth gap is the result of a discriminatory economic system that keeps black households from achieving the American dream. This system has always made it difficult for black households to acquire and keep capital, and this lack of capital has created a persistently large racial wealth disparity, as African Americans have had less wealth to pass on to the next generation than white households. The unjust obstacles to building wealth for black households have existed for centuries, and the iterative nature of wealth begetting more wealth means that without public interventions, it will be virtually impossible for Black Americans to catch up to their white counterparts. Following centuries of oppression of Black households, white households are much more likely to receive an inheritance from their parents and grandparents, and their inheritances are much larger than those of Black households. Moreover, white households have access to larger and wealthier social networks that they can tap into for job and career opportunities for them and their children. Addressing the persistent Black-white wealth gap means countering the centuries-old institutions that have kept Black households from building and growing wealth at the same rate as is the case for white households. This is where reparations come in. The concept of reparations, in the context of addressing the historical injustices suffered by Black Americans, is not a new one. It has been a subject of debate, advocacy, and legislation for many years. One prominent example is the HR40 Bill, which has been introduced in various sessions of Congress since 1989. The bill's title, HR40, Commission to Study and Develop Reparation Proposals for African Americans Act, encapsulates its purpose: to establish a commission that would examine the impacts of slavery and discrimination and propose potential solutions in the form of reparations. Despite being introduced multiple times, the HR40 bill has not progressed to become law. Its introduction and subsequent lack of advancement highlight the challenges and complexities surrounding the topic of reparations. The issue raises questions about the appropriate forms of redress, the mechanisms for implementation, and the broader implications for addressing historical injustices within a diverse and often divided society. Some argue that reparations are necessary to acknowledge the lasting legacy of slavery and systemic discrimination, and to provide compensation for the economic, social, and psychological harms inflicted upon generations of Black Americans. Others contend that reparations might not effectively address the complexities of historical injustices, and that alternative approaches such as investments in education, healthcare, and economic opportunity could have a more meaningful impact. Opponents say reparations would further divide the country. They question who would get the money. Would all Black Americans or only descendants of people who could show that their ancestors were enslaved? They also say it's wrong to have taxpayers finance reparations, given that no one alive today is responsible for slavery. Economist William Darity, who co-authored the book From Here to Equality, which outlines one of the most comprehensive plans for what material reparations could look like, believes that the best way to reckon with America's past and current wealth disparity is through reparations that close the racial wealth gap. According to economist William Darity, the estimate is that this would require an expenditure of approximately $350,000 per eligible recipient. Those direct payments would go to the roughly 47 million Americans who identify as Black. And while you cannot place a monetary value on slavery and its lasting effects, there's a precedent of reparations programs compensating victimized communities directly. Back in the U.S., the Civil Liberties Act of 1988 designated $20,000 payments to Japanese Americans who survived internment camps during World War II. The U.S. government has also made payments in instances where it was not the culpable party payments made to families that lost loved ones during the course of the 9/11 attacks, as well as payments that are being made to individuals who were held hostage in Iran at the end of the Carter presidency, up to $4.4 million per hostage or their states. In the case of slavery, the U.S. government did promise reparations. It's just reneged on it. In fact, when the U.S. finally issued an apology for slavery, it included the disclaimer: nothing in this resolution authorizes or supports any claim against the United States, or serves as a settlement of any claim against the United States. Nor did the U.S. ever provide true reparations, a process consisting of three things: acknowledgement, redress, and closure for grievous injustices. It's vital that the federal government issue an apology, because that will create the justification for the redress plan that follows. That brings us to who would actually receive reparations. Under Darity's plan, the requirements are a little more strict. First, Black Americans would have to have identified as Black, Negro, African American, or Afro-American for at least 12 years before any reparations plan goes into effect. And they'd have to prove that they had at least one ancestor who was enslaved in the United States. One way to do that is using the census. If your ancestor was present in the 1870 census and was old enough to have been alive in 1850 or 1860, but you can't find that person in the 1850 or 1860 census, that would suggest that they were probably enslaved. That's because before slavery was abolished with the 13th Amendment, enslaved people were not counted in the census. They're actually missing people from the 1850 and 1860 census, and their absence there is a potential indicator that they were probably enslaved. But while Darity's plan has received traction, it still faces opposition. The impression down here is that Caribbean people who live in the United States and some groups of black people would not be entitled to any reparation paid by the U.S. government. This has led to many voices standing against such reparations. Regardless, the call for reparations to address the profound injustices inflicted upon black African Americans through slavery, racial discrimination, and hatred is a matter of moral and social responsibility. While some may argue against reparations, the historical evidence of centuries of suffering and systemic oppression cannot be ignored. Acknowledging this painful history, it becomes imperative to take steps towards rectifying the deeply rooted inequalities that persist today. Though there are differing opinions, it is essential to recognize that implementing reparations, even in the form of improved education facilities, healthcare, and housing for black individuals, can contribute to bridging the gaps that have long divided our society. Student loan debt continues to be a significant barrier to wealth creation for black college graduates. Among 25 to 55-year-olds, about 40% of blacks compared to 30% of whites have student loan debt. Blacks also have nearly $45,000 of student loan debt compared to about $30,000 for whites. Recent research finds that blacks are more likely to be allocated unsubsidized loans. These need to change if we are going to close the wealth gap. By providing tangible support and resources to communities that have endured generations of disadvantage, we have the opportunity to promote equality and create a more just and inclusive future. This is not merely about righting the wrongs of the past, but about building a stronger foundation for a united and harmonious society moving forward. By embracing reparative measures that uplift and empower black African Americans, we take a significant step towards a more equitable and harmonious nation for all its citizens. As always, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to our channel, and share our videos to let more people know the truth about blacks and to hear their own part of the narratives. Thanks for watching.